Hey all, welcome back to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton here with Brandon. It's been a couple weeks. Last time you heard from us was the Christmas charity live stream. We all raised over $700 for charity during that 24-hour live stream, so thank you to those of you who gave to that. That money will be donated to the Project for Awesome next month. But let's get back to some card game stuff. Brandon, there was a lot that we talked about on stream. Unfortunately, the 24-hour stream was not saved by YouTube because apparently YouTube doesn't like to archive streams longer than 12 hours. So now we know for next time, but for this time, we lost some of that stuff that we wanted to repost as its own content. So we are going to talk about some of the stuff that we talked about on stream. Specifically, we are going to recap all of the BCS stuff. The singles events have ended for the season, going into Worlds. So we're going to talk about that at length. But first, we have some news in regards to both the ban list and some set releases and dates. First things first, we're going to talk about the JP stream that took place Sunday night. We have a new set confirmed for English Weiss. It is a simultaneous release with JP. We are getting Spy X Family, which is something we were not necessarily expecting to get because it was in Osaka in JP, but both the JP and English side of Weiss will get this set coming out presumably sometime in 2023, but we did not get an official date on it. There aren't any openings until mid to late summer, so I think that's when we are most likely to get it. A lot of other stuff was announced for JP as well, most notably HoloLive 2, as well as Licorice Recoil. Both of those sets certainly possible for English. HoloLive, I would say, is almost a lock. I would be shocked if we didn't get it. Licorice Recoil, also reasonably popular here in the English-speaking world, so I would not be surprised if we got that set as well. Brandon, a lot of things got announced. What are you thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. There were quite a few others that got announced for the JP version of Weiss. A number of those we expect aren't going to make its way across, such as several Disney properties. With that in mind, ones we highlighted here were ones we expect to either see in English or have at least a decent potential to make its way in. Now, there could be others that were announced that could make its way over that we don't see as big of chances coming in. We're still kind of keeping an eye on what that looks like. There are still several sets from previous streams that haven't been announced yet for English that we also expect as well. Potentially things like Overlord 2 or Slime 3 also expect to potentially get announcements here pretty soon. We do have confirmation there will be an English stream at some point, so we're just waiting to see what that looks like when that time comes.
Yeah, the other JP sets announced were Puzzle and Dragon, Ayakashi Triangle, and Alice Gear Aegis. Alice Gear is like technically a maybe, I would say, but I don't necessarily expect it, nor do I expect the other two. Disney is off the table because of Disney's own TCG property that they're planning on launching in the English market, so I would just basically plan on never seeing a Disney property in English for Weiss. But yeah, I think the biggest thing here is Spy X Family. That's coming to English. Again, no date on that yet, but it's a big deal. Not only because it's a good property and one that people are going to get excited about, but also because it kind of demonstrates that Weiss is not necessarily locked out of picking up IPs that show up in other JP card games.
So potentially a good sign for things like Konosuba that was also announced for Rebirth a while back.
Right. Konosuba getting additional, it's getting a spinoff and an additional season for the next year or so. So it wouldn't be surprising at all to see additional Weiss sets for that. Also, we got a announcement in English of a date for Avatar The Last Airbender. It will come out June 16th, trial deck and booster set. We've seen almost nothing. We've seen just one card and it's a stock healer, so a very generic profile. So not a whole lot to go off of with Avatar, but we have a date now. In about 6 months, the Fire Nation will attack.
So our schedule upcoming then, for the release schedule, we have none in January as of yet.
And I doubt that we're going to get anything in January. They're
Right.
taking January off, it seems, potentially as like a Worlds break. Drop anything right before Worlds, so they're just kind of taking a step back for the month, which makes sense. But then in February, we'll have Kaguya. In March, the Power Up sets, followed by DAL 2, Bang Dream 5th Anniversary, SAO Anime 10th Anniversary. Again, we're not getting the light novel version, just the anime version. Saikano Flat out in May, as well as Fruits of Grisaya. So then we're starting to get into Springfest time. We should have some of these out for certain Springfest events, for which we do have a schedule. And then Quint's movie June 2nd, so that's going to be probably less of a Springfest thing and more of a fall thing.
Currently for Springfest, right now, the dates are currently scheduled between March and June 2nd. So currently, Quint's movie set is not available to any specific date of location that's been released so far. We do have quite a few yet to be determined. However, so far, looks like Quint's movie set will not be a Springfest deck, but rather be one for the fall.
Yeah, and of course that depends on when we, what the final dates are for some of those events. But if there is one that goes into June, then there you go. Quint's movie set might be legal for that one. But aside from that, we know everything for Springfest now. We know everything that's going to be legal for Springfest, and I don't believe that there are any cards that we are unaware of either. So we know what all the cards are. We know what everything's going to be for the spring events. And then going into fall, once we're done with Springfest, once we're done with Rumble, we will get into our first Quint's movie set meta, which is definitely going to be interesting to say the least.
With that in mind, because we know Springfest is coming up, as that was announced during the stream, actually, is when they made those announcements that Springfest was going to happen, as well as Bushy Road Rumble once again. Springfest, we have some of the PRs and kind of what the prizes are going to be for those things as well. We have a Kaguya card being that entry promo, and the stock healer being that winner's promo for the team that wins for Weiss for Avatar. We also know that top 3 will receive a special playmat as well for the top 3 teams.
Yep. So we do have Springfest dates. We do have Springfest prizes and promos.
We also have Rumble Online dates as well.
Yes, we do. That will also take place in May. So kind of right near the end of the Springfest schedule is when that will happen. It will be the same format, online tournament, 3 different tournaments over the course of 24 hours. You can enter anyone you wish. Webcam, Discord event. So everything from Saikano Flat and before should be legal for that event. I don't think Fruits of Grisaya will be because it comes out the same weekend. So anything that comes out through the beginning of May, you can play at Rumble. Obviously, it's something that we've talked about. We really like to see the online tournaments. They're important for people who don't have access to a regular locals or a regional that they can get to, either because of geography or expense or other reasons. So obviously it's important that Bushy Road keeps this alive and keeps supporting online play. So we're happy to see the return of Rumble for sure. That will take place at the end of May. So moving on, we have an update in regards to the restriction list as well. Our first update for 2023. Interesting choice by Bushy Road to drop one right before Worlds, but that is what they have done. They're going to hit quintuplets, but they're not going to hit it maybe as hard as some other people expected. It is a choose one of 2 between the next soul counter and the level 0 filter. By and large, people are just going to say goodbye to the neg soul counter with this. What do you think this does to affect the way that quintuplets gets built going into Worlds?
Well, I think realistically, we saw quints in a lot of places already beginning to drop the neg soul counter just in favor of other consistency pieces. So realistically, it's more like a slap on the wrist for quints. But at the same time, it also takes away one of their bigger defensive tools. So just, I think, forces quints to be slightly more offensive with that 8 standby strategy. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. But I definitely think that there's still going to be a lot of 8 standby quints in the Worlds scene.
And I think that there are 2 things with this specifically. One is that this is not the first time that Bushy Road has specifically decided to hit a neg soul or tap counter. So I think we're starting to see something of a trend from Bushy Road, right? Because now they've hit the MTI tap counter. Obviously, they hit Dal's defensive package a while ago now. This seems to be something that Bushiroad is doing on purpose. And y'all know my feelings on the ban list, right? Like, I mean, I'm pretty anti-ban list, but this is an interesting choice because I don't think they're doing this necessarily as a power thing. Because a neg soul counter or a tap counter, as much as it is a powerful piece, it is something that most decks have the ability to play around to a certain extent. But I think it's not a fun card more than anything else. I think that maybe that is the direction that Bushiroad's going with this. Like, this is not a card that people enjoy playing into. And I think that may be the logic here, because this isn't a broken mechanic by any means. It's, it's a pay 3 counter. This is essentially a ban on the counter, right? Because no one's going to stop playing the filter. The filter's too important. And as you said, the Nexal counter was already kind of getting outmoded. So this is definitely just going to remove the Nexal counter from the game entirely, more or less. And it seems like that's their approach, despite the fact that these cards aren't broken, but a lot of people don't like them. What do you think?
I think it's really a ban on stopping your opponent from playing their game. I think it's kind of what you're saying is like being able to negate some of those abilities that affect how your opponent plays the game. I think is definitely kind of what's really being targeted here. Definitely something to keep an eye on as future bans come out.
I think the more interesting thing with this, even than like what they chose to restrict, is the fact that they've dropped a restriction right before Worlds. Odd choice. Especially like, we had a conversation with Bushy Matt, and he indicated that they don't like banning stuff mid-season. They don't like to mess with stuff during essentially a meta. But here they are doing that with just days before the World Championship. Especially because it's not even like a huge hit, right? Like, quintuplets isn't far and away just dominant like that. It's very good, it's very consistent, but it's not dominant.
Well, let's go over the results and kind of point out what it did do in comparison to everything else.
That's fair.
So as we look at the season recap overall, we have the slide here that to help point out like the number of effectively wins, top 3s, top 8s. We broke it down into those different categories in part because top 8, these are kind of the decks that were able to surpass Swiss and get to that top stage. Top 3, because in most cases here for the different tournaments, top 3 are the decks that were going to go to Worlds. And then we have the also wins as well as the ones that were able to beat out everybody else to make it to that top spot. So starting off with 8 standby quints, almost 30 top 8s, 16 top 3s, and 8 wins. So pretty high turnover rate for the deck itself. It was also pretty highly represented, just as kind of that dominant 8 standby deck when it became available.
Obviously was the thing that showed up most in top 8, and it did a great job turning top 8s into top 3s and then wins. But it was still only 20% of top 8 in the tournaments it was legal for, because it wasn't available for, I think, the first 2 tournaments. So it's not like, I remember so many tournaments when Data Live first came out where half of top 8 was Data Live. Data Live's top 8 representation was something in like the 40s. And here you have 8 standby that gets to about 20%. But then once it gets there, it's really good at pushing on and getting the win. Maybe that's why they decided to hit quintuplets specifically. Because they know that 8 standby kind of has an advantage in a room full of these other decks that are at the top tables and we're making those top 8s. So maybe that's their reasoning. 8 standby definitely the best deck in BCS, and Bushiroad has responded to that success by trying to limit it a little bit going into Worlds. It's a very soft ban. It takes away one of its tools, and a tool that, like you said, people are taking out of the deck anyway at this point. So probably doesn't hit it too much. They clearly wanted to have a soft touch on this. They clearly didn't want to just disrupt the list. But I don't love the precedent. I don't love the precedent of adding to a ban list in the days leading up to the World Championship. That rubs me the wrong way. Moving on, There was a lot of Hololive. Like, a lot of Hololive. And a lot of different ways to build Hololive. We've divided it up by the most prominent builds. The Marine top end on its own had something like 35-ish top eights, just because of how consistent it is as a top end. But there were a lot of ways to play into it. The most prominent of which was Kanata, which is that resource building combo that comes down at level 2. Got into top 8, did a good job getting into top 3, but it had a really hard time closing the deal and getting actual wins. It only won 1 of the 20 events in BCS.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. Definitely a deck that has the sustainability to survive Swiss rounds, but definitely having an issue sealing the deal at the top. Yeah, absolutely.
And then MTI 8 Standby. We'll talk more about the other Hololive lists as we go further down the list. But MTI 8 Standby, it picked up 4 wins. So 12 of the 20 events were won by the 2 8 Standby lists. As much as Hololive has done a lot to open up the meta to a certain extent and make the meta a lot more competitive, 8 Standby is still extremely powerful and extremely consistent. And when you hit those triggers, especially because, quintuplets, we talked about that already, but quintuplets, you have the extra triggers essentially. When you can hit your standby triggers, you can overwhelm even Hololive. This is still an 8 standby meta. 60% of these tournaments were won by 8 standby lists. 2 of the top 3 decks were 8 standby decks. Do you think that that's going to change in the near future, or do you think that we're just going to be living in a standby meta through all of Springfest as well?
It's actually really interesting to note that several of those MTI tops were in areas where Quints was either 1, unavailable, or 2, hadn't come out yet. So it's really worth noting that, kind of going into it. That wasn't the case for every single one, but that was definitely a big thing leading into that as well.
Coming into the season, I remember we were having the conversation, like, is quintuplets just going to push MTI out of the meta entirely? Or is it just going to be a replacement, right? Are people just going to set down MTI and pick up quintuplets? And there was definitely some of that. And like you said, in the first couple of tournaments, MTI did quite well. It was the dominant list, but it still was consistent throughout. It was getting top 8s and top 3s and wins throughout the course of the season, even after quintuplets got released. So MTI 8 Standby, like, as much as I think there was conversation about maybe it's going to, completely fade out into obscurity, it doesn't seem to have done that.
No, it hasn't. And I think it has some tools that really help going for it as well. Its ability to compete in the mid game, I think, is a pretty big deal, especially with a lot of other mid game focused decks, to be able to have the right tools and resources needed.
Moving on, Danmachi Salvage Pants, one of the more unique decks. Very event-heavy package, 1k1 climax combos, 13 tops, 3 top 3s, and 1 win. About in line with, I think, where we expected Danmachi to fall coming into this season. What do you think of Danmachi's performance in BCS?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it was definitely similar aligned with, I think, Kanata here, right? It's the 1k1 deck that can do pretty well in Swiss, and then it has a hard time closing the deal. It has the power to step over those standby boards to continually push Soul, but it lacks that explosive finisher that some decks have to be able to fully close out a game.
Yeah, and there are also games where, like, the package just doesn't go off, and if the package doesn't go off, all of a sudden you're small, and you're not getting your pluses, and you're behind in resources, because you're really dependent on clearing your opponent's board, especially if they're playing standby. You're trying to clear that board so that you're forcing them to play cards out of hand, you're forcing them to hand encore their stuff, keeping their resources at a minimum so that when they get to the end game, they can't tri-field you, right? But clearly it didn't do enough of that against 8 standby because it only got 1 win to 8 standbys, 8 or quintuplets 8 standby in particular. Definitely a viable option for Swiss, but it clearly struggled a bit once it got into top 8. Tokyo Revengers Dual Laners. The meme did some stuff. It got 10 tops and 2 top 3s, but it did not win an event. Is Tokyo Revengers still just a meme? or is this something that's viable going into Springfest?
There's definitely a deck here, and there's definitely an explosive finish top end with that. It's definitely a deck that you're gonna have to keep an eye on and intentionally be prepared for. Because if you aren't prepared for it, you will have a very rough matchup.
Moving on again to these Hololive Marine top ends with choice level 1s. We're just going to kind of talk about them together, Karne and Watame. These decks do very similar things, and they achieved very similar results. 12 tops between the two of them, 5 top 3s and a win. Kanata was the most effective resource generating combo for Marine, just in terms of sheer efficiency and results. Do you think that Hololive players are ready to just move past the choice level 1 packages entirely in favor of Kanata, or do you think there's still something here with the choice?
I think that this really just tells us that playstyle is important. Both are viable to get to those spots. I think these ones, especially here, I think that these kind of show that can be done with those level 1 combos, and that Kanata is not the only answer Hololive has. So I think that really this tells me, I think this specifically says playstyle is important too.
Kaguya, finally out from under the banhammer, at least to a certain extent. Still can't play essentially the Chicas at level 0. But you got your K runner back, and Kaguya responded with 6 top 8s, a top 3, and a win. A decent showing for Kaguya. Like, they were basically out of the meta entirely for a minute. But now it's returned, and it's getting more support. Does Kaguya matter going into Springfest? And how much of that is what the current package looks like, and how much of that is what's coming up next month?
I think this says that the current package is important and has a deal of relevance in. With that in mind, and with it getting support, it's definitely a deck to continue to keep an eye on, especially with that K runner to be able to get some additional advantage at 0. Definitely helps it continue forward into that next step.
AOT showed up in the middle of the season, and it had 3 different lists that got tops, including a couple of winners. Salvage Choice, 8 Salvage, and 8 Pants, all doing something in BCS. Again, kind of a smaller sample size, but pretty healthy showing. 10 top 8s between the 3 of them. 4 top 3s and 3 wins. AOT 8 Pants going top 8 twice and winning both of those top 8 showings. Which of these decks is the AOT of the future, Brandon?
I think it still remains to be seen. Like, because we have all of these different potentials and different looks, a lot of this is going to depend and fluctuate on what the other decks have to offer to the table. I think the ones running the salvage level 1 and have the Armin back row, I think are going to be the big contenders going in, especially because they can turn off things like money counter with hexproof. So like having those pieces in play to just be able to deny those targeted effects like tap counter really help that deck continue to do really well, kind of forcing your opponent not to be able to play defensively against it.
A list that's been getting a lot of attention kind of in the sharp circles, but didn't get a ton of play at BCS is this 8 salvage quintuplets list. The thing's super powerful, right? Everyone who plays competitively is aware of this deck and how dangerous it's going to be when the movie set comes out this summer. But for now, in a pre-movie set world, you got 3 top 8s, and that's it. Still insane plussing, still extremely good hand control, and lots of resources to work with. What's the outlook for 8 salvage during Springfest while it waits for its support?
I think it's going to have some real potential there. I think it's definitely been seeing a lot more looks, especially as people prepare for the movie set coming out. So I wouldn't be surprised if more people are on this list going into the fall season. But what's worth noting with trios is we're also going to have a limited supply of what Quince looks like. So there will likely be a Quince list on every team in Springfest. I'm willing to pretty confirm that there's probably going to be a Quince list of some kind on every team. Whether it's 8 standby or 8 salvage, I think is going to depend on the makeup of the team. But I definitely think we're going to see a lot more 8 salvage going forward.
Yeah, and I think that, like you said, because it is a team format and because you're only allowed to play one Quince list, most of those spots are going to be taken up by 8 standby because it's currently still performing better than 8 salvage in competitive environments. But the day is coming when 8 salvage is going to be the deck that everyone hates. So prepare yourselves for that, because that is definitely going to be a thing for the fall season. Starting to wrap up this list, a couple more Hollow Lives. Corne Rushia, How the Mighty Have Fallen. This was a very, very scary deck when it first came out, but it's really fallen off in favor of Kanata Marine. Speaking of Kanata Marine, basically a variant. We won't get into it too much just because it plays the OKU level 1 into the Kanata combo, which you bring down to level 2, and then into the Marine. So it's very bar heavy, tries to use the bars to get its climaxes that it can swap into, develops a lot of resources, and makes the Kanata and the Marine more easy to achieve when it all goes right. But back to Corne Rushia, does this deck matter anymore? 3 top 8s, 1 top 3. It just isn't at the same level as the Marine stuff, clearly.
Well, yeah, it just doesn't have the explosive finisher, right? It's trying to establish board and maintain board presence, and there's been a lot more pieces that can handle that and remove that to make that less viable. The shuffleback is also not as viable with as many like refresh counters or other ways to be able to manage your own compression against it. So like, as long as you can manage your own compression against Rushia's effectiveness has dwindled immensely.
Pantsbook Slime, 2 top 8s, 2 top 3s, and you also took a Pants Wind to 4th place in Chicago. You're the resident Slime player. You tell me, is Slime underrated? Is it this low on the list just because people aren't playing it?
There are a lot of different ways to be able to deal with Slime, and a lot of different ways to be able to handle Slime's game plan. It's also been around long enough that a good majority of people know how to play into it. So it makes it more difficult to pilot throughout this process. It's still good at what it does, being at this point the only one on this list that compresses through memory pretty significantly. That will change as other sets come out, looking at Psychono flat, but especially with the explosive top ends with a lot of these decks, even compressing through memory isn't often enough to be able to prevent all of the damage coming through. So it makes it much more difficult to pilot and much more difficult to go through. These were definitely a couple good, really good meta calls that were able to make the top cut and even take the top spot. Clinton did a great job of taking that spot. So it's definitely a set to continue to keep an eye on, especially as we look forward to potentially getting another set coming out. But I don't think this is going to be as popular as a lot of the other sets we've seen already.
Yeah, Slime is one of those decks that when everything goes right, you're 8 out of 16 and you just never eat damage. You win the game because your opponent literally can't hurt you. But then in other games, you get rushed, you eat 4 that you shouldn't eat, and then that kind of ruins your compression for the rest of the game. So it's definitely got a wide range of outcomes. When piloted well, it will get the good outcome a lot more than the wrong outcome, but you still have to high roll a bit to take Slime all the way through the top tables, given how, like you said, how consistent these top ends are now. The last deck that got multiple top 8s is Tokyo Revengers 8 Pants. Turned those into top 3s. Obviously not as popular as the dual laners, Pachin packages that we saw running around.
Early TRV deck that's slowly making its way out in favor for the dual laners.
And then before we wrap up this conversation, also want to point out the other stuff that made top 3s. A pair of Adventure Time lists, one standby choice, one salvage into standby. Dal book choice. Ruby running choice level 1 into both of its standby combos at level 3. Bang Dream choice level 1 into the layer top end with the Chutu package in the mid game. A quintuplets Exodia deck that uses the Ichika to get its pieces together so that it can just pop off and have a bunch of different things happening at level 3. And then finally, Tokyo Revengers Pants into standby. So, Brandon, is there anything in here that looks like it has some staying power or maybe could grow in its representation, especially as we get into Springfest, which can have a bit of a wider range of sets just because each team has to play three? Or are these decks starting to get outmoded? Most of these, a little bit older at this point, over a year old, most of these. Do you think that they have that staying power, or do you think that this is kind of the last stand for these lists? Or is there anything in here, I should say, that you think has that potential to maintain relevance?
I think a lot of these were definitely meta calls. I think Ruby is worth noting just because it's very similar to that core name Rushia deck from Hololive, except it has also the potential for the explosive top end. So, like, realistically, I think most of these are going to be things that you could see potentially as kind of like that off third lane from Springfest kind of idea. But it's probably not going to be the two main decks you're going to be facing off against.
Yeah, I think that Adventure Time's Choice top end still does a lot of consistent damage. I think that's still, worth noting. Like, if you play into Adventure Time and you see the Choice top end, like, know that you very well could die from 3-0, so you may want to try to find a way to close them out before they have that opportunity. That's probably the one that I'm most attentive to here. Bang Dream obviously has a lot of good stuff. The Choo Choo package is still really powerful against stuff that can't get over it, but it's kind of being outmoded because more and more things, especially 8 standby quintuplets, actually can reach those power thresholds without too much trouble. So that's the stuff that kind of I would say is the most interesting stuff here. You're not going to see this in a whole lot of Springfest teams, although you may see a handful of teams that have one of these lists. So finally, let's wrap up by talking about that tier list that we built on stream. Thank you once again to Darcy from WCC, to Carmen from Pittsburgh and Burn 1, and Clinton Chan for joining us on stream to help put this tier list together. I don't think we have to go over this in too much detail. I mean, we did just kind of go over most of these. This is where things kind of stand right now.
This is also worth noting that not all of these climax combos listed here are the ones that we're talking about here. For example, this is the tier maker from before some of these sets had come out, like AOT and SDS2.
Right. We're going off of what the tier maker just kind of has. But 8 standby quintuplets and Kanata Marine, definitely kind of the 1 and 2 as far as we're concerned. For Worlds specifically, this is like the situation as we stand going into Worlds, and what we think a deck would be able to do at Worlds. AOT obviously did quite well with its limited appearances, so definitely something there. And also the unpredictability, because you don't know what someone's going to be running if they open up AOT against you. So it kind of forces you to play against any number of things in the AOT list. 8 salvage quintuplets, despite its lack of appearances in BCS, still extremely powerful. It kind of got pushed out by its 8 standby counterpart in BCS, but if someone took it to Worlds, I think we all agreed that it had some real potential. Slime, that memory compression engine is something that when it goes off is really hard to deal with, and it still has the potential to do something with it, and we expect to see Clinton playing this list at Worlds, and if Clinton's on this list, I would not bet against him going into top 8. But as for the rest of this, the Tokyo Revengers list, that's the dual laners as we talked about. Didn't get a win at BCS, but definitely still very dangerous. Has a lot of damage potential. The SDS on here, it's the one that you see on the tier list is from set 1, but we're really talking here about set 2. It has more pieces that can help the Meliodas top end, but it also has some other stuff going on. Brandon, what do you think we will see if SDS is at Worlds?
I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be between the 8 standby deck, and it's going to be between the Escanor top end. It's going to be between those two, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that in the context of all of this. It's still very much in that kind of unknown stages as to one who's going to kind of chance it to bring it to Worlds, but I think there's definitely that outside chance to actually like do pretty well with that set.
Yeah, it's definitely a wild card, and like you said, it's recently released. Not a whole lot of people have had a whole lot of opportunity to play into it, especially because it wasn't English exclusive, right? So we don't have the JP cards that we've been able to play into for months. We only got the reveals for this set in the last few months, so still relatively new even to the players who are preparing for Worlds. The other Hololive on here basically is like a catch-all for anything that ends in Marine that doesn't play Kanata. So kind of a mid-tier with an opportunity, but again, another one of those decks that had trouble actually closing the deal. 8 Standby MTI, despite its success in BCS, I think we all kind of agreed that it does not play as well into the 8 Standby Quince game, and it's probably going to have to face more of those than it did at BCS, so that could potentially be a challenge for it. Don Machi had a solid BCS season, definitely gives itself a chance, but like you said, its top end, I think, kind of caps it here on this third line. And then the rest of this is, stuff that's good to decent, but definitely has some kind of flaw. Either it doesn't have the top end it needs or it doesn't have the mid game consistency that it needs. A lot of stuff here that didn't even get multiple top eights, right? Like Bang Dream and Camelot and Fate and Dragon Maid, which had just come out at the very end of the season, so it didn't really get an opportunity to play in BCS. But a lot of stuff here, most of it has something that makes it interesting, but it doesn't have enough consistency either in its closing or its resource generation to really compete with the top decks. And then on the bottom, we've got the stuff that you're playing it because you care about it. Things like Ruby and Sunshine, the Beaufree anti-standby deck, which is just not as good in a Hololive heavy meta. Goblin Slayer still has some pieces, and Konosuba can still push damage. So if you have those and you love them and you're committed to the strategy, then you can win some games with them, but they're not particularly viable in a Worlds context. Looking over this list, Brandon, what do you expect to happen at Worlds, assuming that, these are the kinds of decks that we're going to see there?
It is worth noting that this tier list was also put together before the ban list came out. I bring that up just to say that I think that this is very much a likely scenario of what we could expect to see from Worlds, and so I wouldn't be surprised in any stretch of the imagination if it looks very similar to what this tier list looks like here.
Yeah, and we will be paying very close attention to Worlds. It is the end of the 2022 season coming up here in just a couple of weeks. That will be in Los Angeles, and we're all very excited to see who and what comes out on top, and also to get ready for the new spring season. Springfest is around the corner. Shop challenges are going to be put on the schedule here pretty soon, and we have a lot of new and interesting sets coming out as well. So 2023 looks to be a really fun year for Weiss, our second year kind of back to full swing after a couple years off due to the pandemic. So it's good to get back to playing competitive Weiss on a larger scale, and with a bunch of interesting sets coming out this year, and a bunch of currently good cards still looking like they can hold their relevance through the year. 2023 looks like it's going to be a fun time to be a Weiss player in the English metagame. I believe that is all we have. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back on Thursday. We'll have some gameplay for you with the decks that were built during the live stream. The following Tuesday, Brandon will have a deck tech for, I believe, SDS2. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then we'll have gameplay for that the following Thursday, and in 2 weeks, another Clock Talk. Until next time, thank you so much for joining us. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and have a good one.
We'll see you then.